Hello, welcome to the QI podcast. I am your host, DJ 10th Power. We are at our season finale, and I'll call this one Authenticity. I call it that because of the guest that we have today. As I was visiting New York City here in Pennsylvania, this person welcomed me with open arms. And at the time, she was New York City Council president. And she's a very friendly person. I know she cares about the community. She is now the state rep, and you'll learn more about that when you watch the interview. But I know that this person is an authentic person. Her name is Carol Hill Evans. And I know she cares about the community. She's in it, attending functions. She talks to students and constituents. And she does her job and she cares about it. And that's rare to me in politics, because so many people want the position without having to do the work. Anyway, before we get started with the interview, I like to give a shout out to our listeners and followers in the UK, London, in Hayswood Heath, Brisbane, Australia, Berlin and Hamburg, Germany, Barcelona, Spain, India, and Carrickfergus in Northern Ireland. Thanks for tuning in, and now with our episode. On today's episode, I'm happy to bring you somebody that I grew to love and I totally respect. And when I first started coming to York, she was the council president for City Council of York. And I'd like to introduce a woman of change, Carol Hill Evans.
Hello, how are you?
Thank you. I'm good. And welcome to the QI podcast for the first time.
Yeah, good. Thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to it.
Let's get right into it. Can you tell me what a state rep is? Because that's your current position.
That is my current position. A state rep is one who represents a specific district that's designated by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. There are actually 203 districts. And I represent the 95th district. Within my district, I represent 66,000 people, and that includes the city of York as my core, and then we're surrounded by West York, by Spring Garden Township, and also by Ward 1 of West Manchester Township. So that represents 3 school districts, 28 school buildings, and I know all the people and everything else that goes along with it. So yeah, and what we do is there are really 2 main objectives. The first one is that we are required to pass a budget by June 30th of every year. And we are required to write responsible and effective legislation. So a lot like city council, but on a state level, with, representing more people. And then, of course, so that people do know you, I personally like to be out in the community. I like to hear the voices of all the people or as many of the people that I represent as possible, so that when their concerns come to me, I can find resources for them, but also I can help create legislation where legislation is either not in effect or where it's in effect, but it's not effective. And so we can make amendments to that legislation. But I do that by listening to the concerns of the constituents.
How difficult is it to balance something like a city budget, or at least a budget to the area that you work with?
It's very difficult. Yeah, it's huge. You have to understand your district. You have to understand the needs of the district, and you have to speak up on behalf of your district. So if you know the school districts, like we have a struggling school district within my district, which is the city of York, unfortunately, but I need to understand where are the gaps in what the funding is and what the funding needs to be. I can only do that by speaking to school board members, by principals, superintendents, and finding out, of course, reading the newspaper and then being in those buildings myself so that I can see what I can see in terms of the comparing, say, like a West York to a suburban to a York City school district. And so being there, listening to the conversations, talking to the students really are very up on what they feel like their needs are, whether it's more teachers, whether it's a cleaner cafeteria, whether it's more secure lockers, whether it's more secure school rooms, their rooms. They know what they want and they know what they need. And so just hanging out with the kids and listening to what they have to say, it's huge.
I just, before I interviewed you, I interviewed two students from York, and they led the Black Lives Matter rally that was here in York City, Zipporah Goins and Arlette Morales. And it was a great interview, beautiful,
Yes.
wonderful young ladies.
Yes.
When it comes to funding for schools, where does a lot of that, because I don't know how it works. I'm really blind when it comes to this kind of thing. So where does the money for funding for schools and things like school transportation, you mentioned lockers and things of that nature, where does that actually come from?
You and we pay our taxes. It goes it goes to the state, and then the state determines. It's usually through the appropriations committee. That's where the money, that's where the budget is created. But it comes from accountants, it comes from legislators, it comes from the governor, it comes from superintendents, it really comes from all over. It's like everyone knows that there's a pot of money. So everybody has to get their requests in to say, okay, we need $5 billion and this is how we're going to spend it. But the money actually comes from our property taxes for schools. So when I hear people talk about elimination of school property taxes, yes, it would be ideal, but how do we fund our schools then?
Right.
What happens to our children? What happens to their education? How do we fund an adequate education? So to answer your question, where does the money come from? For schooling, it comes from our property taxes.
One of the frustrating things that I've seen living in Maryland and transitioning here to PA is that some of the schools that need the money the most, the money doesn't get there. Why does that become a problem?
Because money can only go so far. It can only stretch so far. There is this calculation called fair funding formula. And what that does is that it is supposed to equalize where the funds go to. So if you have some school districts where there are greater needs, that money can be funneled into it. Unfortunately, over the years, that formula has not worked effectively. It hasn't worked the way it was intended to work. And so unfortunately, our schools, our poorest schools, are affected by that. Now, when you look at the city and you look at the residents within that city, you look at their properties and their property values, and then the amount of taxes that they pay. So when you're in an urban environment like the city of York, you have many nonprofits who are exempt from paying property taxes. So you have a concentration of people, concentration of services, of course, but you don't have the amount of tax-paying properties that are adequate enough to satisfy the needs of that particular school district.
Wow.
Yes.
Is there more that can be done?
One of the things that can be done is to reform or amend what that fair funding formula that I talked about earlier. Mm-hmm. There are certain amounts of money that go through that before they're dispersed. And so we need to make sure that all the money that is coming into that into that budget for the schools is going through that fair funding formula. So we have, if they were to take all of the money that is supposed to go through that formula, York City School District would stand to increase their budget by $42 million. So you can imagine how transformative that amount of money would be if we could get that $42 million. think about our school buildings, think about the number of support staff that we could have, whether there's school social workers, whether it's additional teachers, different programs that we've had to, put by the wayside over the years. All of those things would just be so much greater and so much more improved.
With the COVID virus situation happening the last 4 or 5 months, has it made your job more tasking, more difficult to execute?
Absolutely, yes. It has been, I have been 10 times as busy as I ever was, because from the beginning, this was all so new. So many people, nobody really knew what to expect. We didn't know where to go for resources. We didn't know who was going to be affected or how we were going to be able to get needed resources to the people who needed it the most, to our most vulnerable. So that would be first of all, our essential workers who were working and continue to work, and God bless them all, who continue to work so hard to keep us safe and keep us healthy and keep us alive. And so pushing out information that everybody needs to know, that was tasking, because before, we don't really have a schedule of 8 to 5, but we would, normally about maybe 7 till 7. But now with information coming out all throughout the day, every single day, including Saturdays and Sundays, we're trying to push that information out. So even though our offices were closed to the public, we were still working remotely. We had to this one had to learn about technology, which was what the holdup was initially. But there are a lot of things that we had to learn, and a lot of things that we have to do now that we didn't have to do before. We still have to be sure that we're servicing our constituents, that if they have issues, that we are available to them. So instead of going from face to face initially, we were going from cell phone to computer. We were getting information from the CDC. We were getting information from Washington, D.C., from Harrisburg, from districts. Information was just flooding into our systems, and we were trying our best to discern what the most important information was so we could get that out to the public. So yes, we were working crazy hours, 6 o'clock in the morning, I'd sit straight up in bed and say, what did I forget or what did I miss? Just to see if anything else had happened overnight that we could find out what we can do to put out those fires. So I want to say kudos to my staff, because I could not have done it without them. They worked very hard and continue to be very diligent in getting out the information and helping the public as much as we can.
As state rep, with the Black Lives Matter going on, and how our voice is now being heard on a bigger platform, one of the things coming out of that is defunding the police. And of course, some people try to push the narrative that we just want to take and shut down police stations, which is not the fact. But we feel like there's money that can be drawn from that and put into resources like we say, the schools, transportation, things of that matter. Has any of your constituents approached you or talked to you about defunding police departments?
No, and when they do, I ask them to please not use that term. It's very misleading. It's a misnomer. Defunding does not mean eliminating police departments.
Right.
So personally, I would not want to live in a place where there was no police.
Me either.
Right. So when we talk about defunding police, and I'm told that that's a Democratic expression, that maybe we should just try to not use that term. Okay. And let's talk about reappropriation or reappropriating the funds that we do have for the police. If we want to take those dollars and we want to put them someplace else, let's first of all be as responsible as we can. And when I say that, I mean, if you haven't completed your census, complete the census.
Right.
Those are the dollars that we need to do the kind of programs and training that we need to train our police to learn how to deal with us as a culture, us as a race, us as a people, us as an urban environment, and then to help fund our schools so that we're not struggling year after year after year and watching our students get further behind because we don't have the funds to educate them the way they deserve. And by law, we are required to educate them. So I say to everybody who's listening, please, if you have not completed your census form, do so. If you know of somebody who hasn't completed their census form, browbeat them into doing it. Make sure that they're doing it, because those those are dollars that we need. They estimate that approximately each person, approximately it equals, I think, is $2,100 to $2,300 per person. Wow. So if you do that type, multiply that, times the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania or even the 95th district, those are huge dollars that can be shared, for all of the things that we need. So have people talked about, it's a conversation that I hope never goes away. We have to continue to have these conversations, right, about Black Lives Matter, but also about moving forward and taking control of our lives, our environment, and our situations, so that we are one strong voice and one strong movement, and we know that we need to move forward together to get it done, to right wrongs over the years. So I'm off my soapbox now.
Along with the completing the census is registering to vote. And I've shared this with other people that I've interviewed. I get into this argument all the time with people on Facebook about the importance of voting. Of course, a lot of people support voting, but there are those who believe that their vote is not that important or it doesn't get recognized. And I understand the complaint when it deals with the Electoral College, but there's so many other levels that you can cast a vote. And in my thinking, there's just too many people that died or fought for my right or privilege to vote. So that's just something I'm not going to take for granted. But can you send home a message also about the importance of registering to vote and practicing to vote?
When you don't vote, you get something like what's in the White House now. Whether you believe it or not, too many of us stayed home, not enough of us got out there and voted, and look what we got as a result. So if you didn't vote in the 2016 election, hey, you can't complain, right, because you allowed it to happen.
Right.
So I always say that everybody has a voice. And if you really want your voice to be heard, go to the polls. Go to the polls. Vote. Your vote is your voice. If you want your voice to be heard, truly heard, then by all means, you have to vote. Get registered. And to that end, next Saturday, August 15th, there is going to be a Freedom Ride, which is it's a ride that was organized by the Buffalo Soldier Motorcycle Organization. And we're going to be meeting at the American Legion, Post 127 on West Cottage Place. And we're going to ride around the city a couple times on motorcycles. And then we're going to head over to Penn Park, where there is going to be a voter registration drive.
All right.
And, yes. And just to be clear, I am a registered Democrat, and I say that loud and proud. But when we're signing people up for voter registration, we cannot tell them which party to sign up for. Okay. We can only tell them to register or ask them to register to vote. So everybody come out. We want to make it as big and large and huge as possible so that we can get more people registered to vote. There'll be vendors there. So if you're a vendor, there's not going to be any fee that day. You don't have to get a permit. You could just come out. So just come on out. It starts, I think the ride is at 10 or 10:30, and then we'll head straight over to Penn Park after that. So probably around 11 o'clock, okay. We'll be kicking off that voter registration. Get out there, get registered to vote. And then once you do that, be sure to vote. And if you don't want to go out to the polls, you now have no excuse not to vote, because you can do it by absentee or by mail-in ballot.
Amen.
Very important.
You heard that first here on the QI podcast. Now, what would you like to see happen in your area or any area in the future for Pennsylvania moving forward?
In terms of what?
Changes that we see around things that we like to see fixed, like we want to see more money go to the schools. Me personally, I like to see some of these roads repaired in the city of York. I
Yes,
hear that
yes.
complaint a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So what challenges does the city face, or where you would like to see go from here?
Uh, that's a wow. What would I like to see happen? Actually, I'll start with minimum wage because we need to regain our freedom from dependence on the state or the federal government to provide us with our needs.
Okay.
We as a people, we as women, we as anyone,
Mm-hmm.
working for $7.25 an hour, if you do the math, that's a person who's living on $15,000 a year. A year. Can you imagine that?
That's not going to cut it.
Not at all. Not at all. So if you double that, to $15, a little over, that still is $30,000 to $35,000 a year. And
Mm-hmm.
although that's much better than the 15, when we talk about a living wage, how many of us who has two parents and even two children in the household can live on $35,000 a year without at least some amount of help or assistance? And so we have to work on getting that minimum wage to where it needs to be. What that does is it gives you a sense of independence. It restores your morale, how you feel about yourself. So that's one thing that I really think that we need. The second thing is a lot more controversial, but I think that we missed an opportunity 6 years ago when we were first started talking about legalizing marijuana. And so we really need to take a good hard look at that,
Mm-hmm.
not for so much for purposes of revenue, although it is going to present a good deal of revenue.
Mm-hmm.
I'm told that if we had passed the bill when it first came through the House and the Senate and passed it, that the amount of revenue that it could have generated from then till now would represent us not having the kind of deficit that we have in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So that means that we wouldn't have to worry about our school districts or our municipalities raising taxes
Mm-hmm.
because it would go directly to taxes in schools, so taxes and education. And so that's something that we can't not continue to have that conversation. We have to decide what we're going to do, how we're going to do it. And this is adult use, not
Right.
for kids,
Mm-hmm.
adult use.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we need to talk about that. Criminal justice reform, we absolutely have to have that reform. There's a young man who's been working very diligently with legislators, Speaker of the House, the governor's office, to pass House Bill 80. And what that would do is that would restore driving licenses to those people who have they've had their licenses taken from them.
Oh, okay,
So we
okay,
would to restore their driving licenses,
okay.
because what that does is that helps people to be able to support their family, to provide for their family. When you think about bus drivers, when you think about truck drivers, when you think about just people going from home to work to back,
Right.
and they have to rely on somebody, or if they rely on public transportation and transportation is late, they're late, that's a risk of their jobs. And so we really need to look at that as well.
Mm-hmm. Ms. Hill Evans, I want to thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you. Are we done?
Yes, ma'am, we're done. But I want you to stay because
That's all you
there's
want?
something I want you to see. But
Okay.
I appreciate your time and being on the podcast in the Lion's Den. I want to invite you to come back anytime to share any
Yes.
new updated information with us.
Thank you. I would be happy to do that. I'm really very happy to do that.
Great. And that does it for our season finale of the QI podcast. I'd like to thank our special guest, Miss Carol Hill Evans. If you have any questions or comments on this episode or any other previous episode, you can email me at theqipodcast@gmail.com or therealqipodcast@gmail.com. Or you can hit me up on Instagram or Twitter at the QI Podcast. I am your host, DJ 10th Power, coming to you from the Lion's Den. I hope to see you in Season 3, where we start off with a special 3-part episode. Season 3 will kick off with a special 3-part episode coming from somewhere in Purple Land. That's a hint. See you then. Peace.